Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Bennett, and I want to welcome you to today's Textile Talk. That music really gets me going. I'm an independent artist and the board co-chair and events chair of the Surface Design Association, a membership nonprofit focused on contemporary fiber and textile art. I'm delighted to welcome you this week to the Textile Talk, Dignifying the Dead, Memorialization Through Fiber Art, with Caren Garfen, Robin L. Bernstein, and Mirka Knaster. Textile Talks webinars are brought to you by the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. First, I'd like to share a few housekeeping announcements. This is a webinar. Your screens and mics are not active or showing. We welcome questions, which we'll answer at the end of the presentation. Please submit them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We are honored to bring you free and inspiring Textile Talks programming. We respectfully ask you to be courteous in the chat comments as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. Your chat comments can be seen by everyone. Please use the Q&A for questions, chat box for greeting others, and survey for commentary or ways we can improve. If you prefer not to see notifications at the end of the chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. So for today, for some, the universal themes of memory, trauma, and suffering inspire work that considers how we mourn and memorialize our dead through stitches, color, textures, and shapes. Caren Garfen, Robin L. Bernstein, and Mirka Knaster translate memory and loss into physical objects, giving voice to individuals whose lives were cut short or for whom no physical memorial may exist. Mirka Knaster leads our program today and will introduce the other presenters. And I'd like to introduce Mirka at this point. Following a decades-long career as a writer-editor, Mirka creates abstract 2D and 3D pieces and installations with handmade paper and textiles in an improvisational and intuitive process in her studio overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Her recent series of hand-stitched, rust-dyed, repurposed cloths focuses on diaspora, while a new project is centered on her family's tragic history in Poland. Her award-winning work has been widely exhibited in North America and Asia. Mirka?
Thank you, Astrid.
All right.
I know I can speak for the three of us that we really appreciate this opportunity to share what is meaningful to us and actually also relevant to everyone, not just us. For all of us will encounter the death of others at some point in our lives. Next slide. And the work on the left is Robin's, the work in the center is Caren's, and the work on the right is mine. And each one of us will talk about these pieces and more. Next slide. So Belgian-American novelist, poet, and memoirist May Sarton said, "What is there to do when people die? People so dear and rare, but bring them back by remembering." I'd like to offer some background for why the three of us are involved in fiber art as a type of memorialization. First, an understanding of the word. Next slide. What does it mean to memorialize? In some cases, it's to actually create a memorial object. Next slide. Historically, that was a statue, and frequently it was a man on a horse, not something representative for most of us. or was a huge marble obelisk, and so on. Next slide. However, today, some artists are creating memorial objects of very different forms and making them out of a variety of materials rather than only stone or metal. To memorialize also means to make people remember a person or an event, or to show that you remember them, including ceremonies of commemoration. The performance of memory through deeds, actions, speech, and the arts assists us in the process of not forgetting and binds us to previous generations. Next slide. Reflecting on her novel, Beloved, Toni Morrison mentions the importance of memory as a way to recollect, remember, reassemble the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. Next slide. People around the world engage in particular cultural rituals to honor the dead. You might recognize some of them. Fiber is usually involved when there is draping of the body, when there are altars to cover, or designated areas to set apart from the rest of a room. Special clothes to be worn, or objects made out of paper. Up in the upper left corner is a Chinese cemetery and paper money. The bottom left is a Chinese altar, a home altar. And on the right is ofrenda. This is a Mexican custom for Dia de los Muertos, and it's a home altar. Next slide. Among the ancient Egyptians and Incas, the dead bodies of royalty and nobility were wrapped in layers of fine textiles. These are remnants found in tombs. The upper part is Egyptian, the lower part is Incan. In the Jewish tradition, when a person dies, the body is ritually washed and dressed in a simple white shroud of muslin or linen before burial. Next slide. In the practice of kriya, the closest relatives rend an outer garment before the funeral. This cut of cloth is symbolic of the tear in the hearts of the bereaved. Next slide. And if we know the date of death, there is the custom of annually lighting a yahrzeit, which in German or Yiddish means 1 year's time. And it's a candle which burns for 24 hours for the deceased. These diverse practices of attending to the dead are feasible when there is a body, a burial, and a gravesite, or there are ashes for an urn. But what if not any of those is present, and all we have is absence? How do we memorialize that? I ask this question because dignifying the dead cannot always be carried out according to cultural or religious law. As we'll see in this presentation, it is possible for art to step in and fulfill that role. The customs that people traditionally practiced were unachievable during World War II, when the Nazis gassed, shot, starved, or worked people to death, then cremated them or dumped them into mass graves. Next slide, please. I'm thinking of the Roma. They used to be called gypsies, the disabled, homosexuals, Jews, and political dissidents. When families were broken apart during hiding or deportations, it became unlikely that they could ascertain the place and time of someone's perishing. Then how could one honor the dead, something that is sacred to every culture around the world? So in this image, at the top is the river where the Tutsi were dumped in Rwanda. On the left, killing fields of Cambodia, and on the right, mass graves at a forest in Poland. So I think of the people who were slaughtered in the killing fields of Cambodia, the Armenian genocide, the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Muslims in Bosnia, los desaparecidos in Latin America, and of course the millions of African slaves. As we unfortunately know all too well, There is an endless list of atrocities. Next slide. Although the three of us were not alive during World War II, we experienced the reverberations of that catastrophic time. We will be speaking about how we use our fiber art practice to specifically memorialize individuals who perished in the Holocaust and others who have been killed since then. While the context for memorialization may vary for different groups, the desire, even responsibility, to mourn and dignify the dead remains the same around the world. As Irish novelist and poet James Joyce remarked, in the particular is contained the universal. Next slide. The three of us deal with the particularity of our ethnicity, but it is based on emotions that are universal. Whatever culture any of us belongs to, our identity is bound up horizontally with other individuals, be they parents, spouses, children, neighbors, and so on. We are also joined vertically to those who came before us as a link in the chain of generations. And this image is of 5 generations in an Armenian family. We are characters in a history that began long before we arrived and that will continue long after we are gone. We are participants in the making of cultural memory. Next slide. Let's begin with Robin. Robin L. Bernstein studied art in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And this was all before earning her MFA in painting and drawing from the San Francisco Art Institute. Once she discovered wood construction, she began to combine wood carvings with thinly cut sheet metal, hammered together with thousands of tiny escutcheon pins. Years later, she began pressing colored string into wax after learning about the Huichol Indians and their spiritual practices in central Mexico. Her current work responds to urgent contemporary concerns, as well as relevant historic events. She lives in Northern California and is represented by Transmission Gallery in Oakland. Okay, Robin, you're up next. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Mirka, for your knowledgeable and sensitive introduction to the subject. Remembering works best if the event or person or experience that has triggered the memory is alive within us because we were there. When the person or event is remembered secondhand, so to speak, and the storyteller is intent on passing the memory along, then the memory may stay alive in the next generation. Third generation, the uniqueness that was that person or event becomes clouded, generalized, a name or short story vaguely recollected, and ultimately lost to time, especially without photographs, letters, diaries, recordings, music, art, or handmade things that have been passed down. Next slide. I'm going to show you and highlight a few images from my series, Beauty and Terror, a body of work made between 2009 and 2022, and I'll also talk about my process. Since completing the series, I have focused my work on other urgent contemporary issues, as Mirka said. Beauty and Terror is a group of 18 pieces, 18 being a numerical symbol of life in Judaism. They're all made of string and wax about the Holocaust, a state-sponsored crime of such brutality and horror that it has been well documented. 6 million Jews and millions of others were outright murdered. Some have been memorialized by their families, by Holocaust museums, by being included in survivor testimonies, films, poems, and memoirs. The overwhelming majority have never been or are not remembered because they vanished, leaving no one to remember them. How can a person, an artist, express the vastness of this particular loss? Museums do it with piles of shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, photos, film clips of bulldozers shoveling corpses like logs. And it works in the way that it does. I make this work to remember the invisible people as well as a personal activist practice, memorializing them by highlighting and telling of the circumstances of their deaths, places, methods, sometimes the names of the murderers, but I also include heroic acts of resistance by individuals and stories of redemption, like this piece, the story of how Primo Levi, a great 20th century author, was saved by the axe of one man. Mob rule, weapons, and government institutions bent on isolationist, nationalistic, authoritarian leadership leads and creates the need for memorializing the forgotten dead. Next slide. These pieces are many things, as I said. They are memorials, they honor the victims, namely those who left nothing and no one behind. They are educational, and they work to help dispel Holocaust denial. And they also serve as warnings against increasing violent anti-Semitic threats and terror attacks and a rising white nationalistic, white supremacist movement in the US and abroad. It is much easier to manipulate a public which is unfamiliar with the past, and this alone highly motivates me. We must do what we can to minimize societal amnesia. Knowledge is power. Next slide. Before a single Jewish person was rounded up, 10,000 German infants, children, and teenagers were secretly murdered by their own government in a program of child euthanasia. By the end of the war, up to 300,000 mentally or physically disabled non-Jews, mainly from Germany, Austria, and Poland, were gassed or poisoned with the sole intention of creating a master German race, and also as a money-saving scheme, as these children were referred to as useless eaters by the Nazis. Who remembers these children? The German National Memorial to the people with disabilities murdered by the Nazis was dedicated in Berlin in 2014. There is currently a growing movement of German citizens bent on removing it, and this monument has been repeatedly vandalized. T4 was the code name of this program, which came from the Berlin address of the program's coordinating office, Tiergartenstrasse 4. Next slide. In planning and making the series, I understood two things. One, extremely difficult subject matter, especially about murder and death, is often not anticipated by viewers entering contemporary art galleries or art museums. Two, that in order for me to be successful, I needed a vehicle for the content that would encourage the viewer to stay with the work long enough to allow my message to be received and the composition and process be appreciated and understood. I use fiber of every color and every texture, and I use beauty as my vehicle. Next slide. This is T4 in progress. You can see the waxed yellowish surface, the string, the stick I use, and the manicure scissors I use to cut with. My process is this. I gather ideas, I do research, I collect and draw my images, design my composition on a wood panel, and I take my jigsaw and I cut it out. Having drawn over my pencil lines with Sharpie marker, I melt a mixture of beeswax and other ingredients over my drawing, which hardens as it cools. Being pliable, sticky, and strong, the wax now acts as my adhesive for the string. Next slide. The process is slow, meticulous, and very time-consuming. Each piece takes me many months to complete. This labor-intensive process matches the content I use in such a way as to give reverence and respect to the stories and histories I tell and to the people who died. Next slide. The beautifulness and efforts in making each work gives each one a feeling as though it is treasure, because when someone spends a lot of time, focuses, and carefully makes an object, it has the immediate feeling of being something compelling and something valuable. Much of the fiber I used for this series was vintage, made in Europe in the early and mid-1900s. I collected it from flea markets and garage sales, thrift and antique stores, my friends' mothers and grandmothers' sewing baskets, eBay, and the back room of Pacific Textile Arts in Fort Bragg, California. Yay, PTA. Next slide. This piece is about the Romanian pogrom and death train and is an excellent example of pure mob violence and human behavior when consequences and accountability simply do not exist. This was considered the worst pogrom of World War II, where over 13,000 Jews were rounded up, robbed, stripped, tortured, and shot. The piece is about a train journey that never left Romania. No Germans were involved in this horrific event. 2,500 traumatized survivors of the initial pogrom were literally stuffed into train cars, and the train simply circled around Romania. You can see the repeating names of the cities in the extreme heat with the ventilation slats nailed shut until 2,200 of them died of heat, suffocation, and wounds sustained in the pogrom. The dead bodies were offloaded at various places along the route. The shape of this piece is from a medal awarded to German soldiers for acts of bravery, awarded by the Romanian government. A black obelisk was installed in front of the Great Synagogue in Iași in 2011. It has been repeatedly vandalized and gravestones stolen from the nearby Jewish cemetery. Permanent markers often become targets. Next slide. Up to 950,000 Jewish people were murdered at Treblinka, a major Nazi extermination camp in Poland. This took place during the 15 months between July 1942 and October 1943. Men, women, children, infants, and the elderly arrived in boxcars to what appeared to be a very real train station, with even flower boxes. I created this web as the central panel and hid the name of the camp within it, as Treblinka was a trap. Next slide. 3,000 people were murdered every 3 hours by this process, and the corpses burned to ash in huge cremation pits where the pyres burned 24 hours a day. Theft of cash and personal valuables was conducted by the SS for the Third Reich. Individual guards stole for personal gain. Only 67 of the 950,000 survived Treblinka. Several wrote memoirs. The last survivor of Treblinka, Samuel Willenberg, died in 2016. If we don't talk about it, if we don't make art about it, sing about it, write about it, teach about it, then no one will know about it. And these deaths will have been in vain in helping to prevent another Holocaust. Next slide. Volery, the word volery refers to a flock of birds kept in an aviary, but in this case, it refers to the town of Volery in the Czech Republic, near the border with Germany. It was the endpoint of a brutal death march by the Nazis of over 1,300 women and girls. This piece honors the survivors with Nike, or Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, as the central figure, and also memorializes the murdered women simply by my telling you this story right now in this moment, and by my showing you this artwork. The 1,300 women and girls were rigorously marched over 800 kilometers in the snow and freezing temperatures under brutal conditions, humiliated and shot mercilessly by their female SS guards if they could not continue marching. Next slide. Before the war, there were 3 million Jewish people living in Poland. Now there are 4,500. The story of this piece is a big reason why. An 8-year-old Polish boy incited the Kielce pogrom after the war. This boy, named Henryk Blachek, and his father accused local Holocaust survivors of kidnapping Polish children and holding them in a building, committing ritual murder. This false accusation resulted in a massacre of innocent survivors. In 1998, when that boy turned 60 years old, he told a journalist that this entire story was a lie. The ruthlessness of this action and these murders sent the international message that Jews would not be safe to return to their homes across Europe, and thus began a mass exodus of survivors and the flood of homeless immigrants to the newly created state of Israel and other places where even a sliver of an invitation was offered, having been deemed unwelcome elsewhere. The inclusion of putti or cherubs in Renaissance and Baroque paintings always signifies the presence of God. I include them in many of my works as it invites the consideration of what the presence of God might mean given the circumstances. Last slide. I thank you for allowing me to share this work and to tell you these stories. It is of utmost importance given the extreme rise of anti-Semitism in our time, especially since October 7th. I'm very grateful that you invited me, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Robin, for your important and beautiful work in keeping history alive. Let's continue with Caren. Caren Garfen is an award-winning artist specializing in textiles and painstaking hand stitching, creating carefully considered pieces with profound messages. She seeks out commonplace objects, which become potent devices. Next slide. When placed side by side with her meticulous craft. Her focus was on gender politics and women's issues in the 21st century. But in 2019, she changed direction to research the Holocaust and examine the shattering rise in global anti-Semitism. Based in London, she has established an international reputation with work exhibited widely in the UK, Europe, Japan, United States, Canada, and Australia, and found in public and private collections. Caren? Caren, you're on mute. There we go.
Hello.
We can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you, Mirka, for that introduction, and thank you to Robin for such an enlightening talk about your work, which is both exquisite and devastating in content. This is slide 1, and I'm just beginning with this collage of some of the 40 works that I've created over the past 5 years. Each piece addresses the Holocaust, contemporary anti-Semitism, or a combination of them both. Next slide, please. In this slide, I wanted to show you the early stages of creating an artwork, specifically selection 1. I had stored a large box of vintage ophthalmic lenses in my studio for many years, originally planning to use them for a project on eating disorders. However, they'd never got used, and they found their true purpose in 2020. I used the lenses as frames to contain my hand-stitched memorials. They not only serve as a practical element, but also evoke images of piles of spectacles, as you can see here, confiscated from Jewish people before they were sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. Next slide, please. Using a $50 coin as a reference, you can get a sense of the scale of the work and the size of the stitches. You can also see the needle next to the text. The stitches are tiny, which means the process takes a considerable amount of time, providing an opportunity for reflection and meditation whilst hand sewing. Next slide. This is selection 1, which was chosen for the Five for Art Australia Art Textile Biennale in 2020, an exceptional exhibition dedicated to the very best in fibre art. The piece travelled to 3 different venues across Australia, and I was thrilled to learn that it had won an award. During my research for Selection 1, I sought to find a cross-section of Jewish people from across Europe who were murdered during the Holocaust, focusing specifically on those who wore glasses. Given the impossibility of hand-stitching details of over 6 million victims, this selection allowed me to honour and respect these individuals by giving them a name and sharing some details of their past lives. This stands in stark contrast to how the Nazis and their collaborators selected them for death or forced labour. While I was pleased with the result, I felt the artwork needed another dimension, as anti-Semitism neither began nor ended with the Holocaust. I then began researching individuals who have been murdered in more recent times because of their ethnicity. Next slide, please. This slide shows Selection 2 in situ, which was selected for the Riga International Textile Triennial, another outstanding and vast fibre art exhibition. I had the good fortune to visit Riga and speak with the curator who had arranged 1.5 vitrines with the lenses as seen here. Curious about his curatorial decision, I asked him about it. He was not surprised by my interest, as he had already explained to his assistants why one of the display cases remained half filled. He felt it was essential to leave empty space as a poignant reminder of those lost to history and those who might still face violence in the future. This resonated deeply with me, aligning with my own approach to the work. I believe that the 2 memorials here illustrate this concept. Jacob Hagman and George Valinsky both worked for newspapers. Jacob as an editor and George as a cartoonist. Yet they were murdered many years apart, one in the 20th century and the other in the 21st century, both because of hate. Next slide, please. This is the final slide showing Selection 3 in progress. I began stitching it in early 2023, feeling that there was more to say on this theme. In June of that year, I visited an exhibition of an international artist whose work consisted of hundreds of small pieces, such as pebbles and shards of pottery, displayed across a wide expanse of the gallery floor. I mentioned to my friend who I was with that I would love to create an artwork of that scale. She encouraged me, saying, yes, you could do this. On my way home, I thought about it and realized I was already on that journey with the selection lenses. I could combine Selection 1, Selection 2, and Selection 3 to create one large art installation, which I now propose to do. I continued with this piece through 2023, but could never have anticipated the devastation of the 7th of October, when over 1,200 innocent men, women, and children were murdered by Hamas terrorists in Israel. In response, I immediately began stitching memorials for the victims, this time in real time. This has been the most challenging process of my art practice. In the past, I've maintained a certain distance between myself and the subject matter, but now I'm confronting something so raw and emotionally overwhelming. Despite the difficulty, I continue because it is crucial to document the truth. I would like to conclude with this thought. Recently, I have revisited my earlier artworks. I found the experience rather sobering. A piece from 2020, collaged with text, made it painfully clear that nothing has changed. In fact, the situation for Jewish people has significantly worsened. This makes the act of remembering more vital than ever. I will continue to memorialize victims, both past and present. Through my work, I am stitching together a devastating history of our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Caren, for your dedication to remembering the forgotten in such a careful and detailed way.
Thank you.
Next slide. I have spent many years doing research to piece together where and when my parents' family members perished. Then last year, deeply inspired by Robin's and Caren's work, I envisioned how to memorialize them. Several months ago, I went back to Poland, this time to Chełmno, also known as Szelmino, the extermination camp where most of my father's family was killed, and I took photos. I now know what I'll create for an installation, possibly in my father's city, Łódź, which we in English say Lodz. This project is not just to dignify those who were treated so inhumanely, but also to claim the family I have never known. I grew up without grandparents, aunts and uncles, or their children. I feel a need and responsibility to honor them as a gesture of profound gratitude for the life I am privileged to have, because their deaths eventually led to my birth. Next slide. My mother and father, the sole survivors of their families, lost their previous spouses and children during the war. As refugees, they later met, married, and conceived me in southern Italy. My life began in a displaced persons camp in Bari along the Adriatic Sea. Next slide. Because whatever family photographs were destroyed in the war, I have nothing I can print on fabric to create portraits. And also, I have no way of knowing whom I look like. Instead, I'm working with the photographs I took of the Zujovsky forest, which was near, just outside of Chełmno, as you could see in that earlier map. And this forest is where most of my father's family members were buried in mass graves. It is the site of genocide as well as ecocide. Next slide. As trees were cut down to make space for the graves, and also to build fires for burning the bodies when they were later exhumed to hide evidence of murder. Next slide. So this is where I went to this forest. This is one of the mass graves. Next slide. And this is another one. You can see how much space, how many trees had to be cut down in order to create these mass graves. Next slide. Using fiber materials, I can also construct birds to represent their invisible souls and name them. Birds can be seen carved on gravestones like this one, which I found in the cemetery in the town where my father's mother's family was from, Podembisa. Next slide. Like Caren, I believe naming is an important act of recognition. When people are reduced to numbers, as prisoners, as specimens, as medical cases, they are stripped of their beingness, for numbers are abstract. They are not flesh and blood. Next slide. These are names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Names are an essential part of one's identity in every culture. They give a sense of who one is, of one's community, and thus a place in the world. Names have emotional significance. They connect us to a family, to a society. Being called by a number rather than a name can indicate loss of freedom. My name, Mirka, is for my maternal grandmother, who was shot by the Nazis, and so obviously I never got to meet her. Next slide. Because I am presently engaged in the process of my memorial project, I don't have any images as yet. However, I can share photos of my ongoing diaspora series, which in its own way is also a memorialization. I didn't realize at the time I started it a few years ago that I was unconsciously moving toward the memorial work. As creatives, we don't always know why we're making something, but we intuit that it's what we need to do. Too often, death, especially in massive numbers and devastation, forces us to move away. When we no longer have a home that is safe, we immigrate to where we hope we can begin a new life. Like millions of others then and around the world since, my parents lost the places where they had grown up, gone to school, married, and raised their families. Eventually, the three of us wound up in America. Still, given the diasporic history of many ethnic communities, not just mine, there's always the possibility of having to find yet another haven. I'll briefly go through 3 parts of this ongoing series. What you're looking at right now is called Journeys into Unknown Territory, and the strips are handmade paper created by a master paper maker in Korea. I was going to Korea regularly, and I wound up in his shop. And I bought these pieces, not having worked with paper before, but I was so drawn to them and I couldn't figure out why, but I brought them home and I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do with these. But one day I just started stitching and realized that they were imaginary landscapes. And I just followed the contours of the organic shapes. Nothing is dyed, it's just the original paper. And next slide, please. And I just followed the details in them. I used embroidery floss. Next slide. I used yarn, I used raffia, I used pearl cotton. So even though they are not about anyone in particular, I find that Journeys into Unknown Territory also memorialize the millions of unknown people who have been on the move for thousands of years, dying far from their native lands. I think of all the people trying to reach a country in order to work to help support their families back home. The people who cross the Mexican border and wind up dying in the desert. The people in boats trying to get to land only to drown. And others who are transported in closed containers in lorries across Europe, and they die in the vehicles. Next slide. This is part of an exhibition that was at Gallery Route 1 in Point Reyes Station in Northern California. And the next slide, please. And both aspects are part of this series called Where's Tomorrow? Where would we have to go tomorrow if things change and we can't stay where we have lived our entire lives? And I work with rust a lot. I really enjoyed dyeing with rust. I have used the lining of old kimonos that I brought back from Kyoto. I use other cloth that I repurpose and dye with rust. Next slide, please. And these are 2 samples from Where's Tomorrow. I found that the rust, the effect of the rust is it made the cloth look like maps. And so I've been stitching them as though they were maps. Next slide, please. This is called Where Can I Go? Where Might I Belong? It's all rust dyed pieces. And this is at an exhibit at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. Next slide. So you can see how the rust dyed in my stitching create maps. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So I work with embroidery thread, as I said, I work with pearl cotton, whatever I need to stitch the rust-dyed cloth. Next slide. This is a piece that it's in progress. It's taking me a very long time. Next slide. So whichever group we belong to, as descendants of people who suffered religious or political persecution, genocide, slavery, whatever the historical trauma, we can make a connection to the past in the present. We can connect with people we did not know but heard about and identify through archival records, as I have. Fiber art is another means with which we can memorialize them, especially those who were dehumanized and died catastrophically, those who were never dignified with even a proper burial. Memorializing the dead is also truth-telling when others want to deny and hide the fact of oppression, violence, and murder. Art thus also serves as a different medium to convey history. For the three of us, it's not about working with stark, horrific images. It's about remembering people who were ignominiously murdered simply for having Jewish ancestry. Remembrance through aesthetics is our way of adding to history, not as a textbook, but as a visual, tactile encounter. Although Carolyn Mazlumi expresses her focus on African-American history through quilting, her words are just as valid for other forms of artistic expression. Art can make a statement about difficult subjects, whereas people might not want to read about those difficult subjects, but you can render them in quilts, and hopefully, when people see them, it will make them think. Visuals have power, just as words have power. I forgot to mention that my background is a detail of one of my pieces in Where Can I Go? Where Might I Belong? I'd like to end with a statement that has been repeated by various people. Next slide. We die twice. Once when the body ceases to function and is consigned to the grave or reduced to ashes. And again, when at some point in the future, our name is uttered for the last time. It's a good enough reason to remember for as long as we can. And our artwork can be a vehicle for doing that. Artists can stand vigil over the memory of those who might otherwise be forgotten. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you for your very kind attention. Our websites where you can see our work are in this slide, and I believe they're also in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirka, Robin, and Caren. This was a deeply felt, strong presentation. And we have several questions. We have a little bit of time. I'd like to bring a few of them up. One personal question I have that I think a lot of us are thinking about: how do you maintain your sense of emotional balance when you're doing this difficult work? I know it's balanced by the sense of urgency that, Robin, you seem to convey in bringing this message across. But do you have any comments about that? Because I think that's something many of us artists feel when thinking about doing work.
Yes. Well, I can answer first. Making this work is actually a healing activity, because the stories and what I discover about it is extremely emotional and heart-wrenching and difficult. And when the reason I make the work in no small part is because I feel a little bit better. when I make it. And I know that people will see it, and to be educated about it gives me great satisfaction. So that's a
Yeah.
big part of it for me.
Did you have any other additions to that, Mirka or Caren? And you don't have to, the work speaks for itself too.
Well, I find the whole thing very emotional. I mean, I always have done, and in the past, I was able to separate the emotions from the actual research, the stitching. I could do that, but now, as we have seen, there's been such a huge increase in anti-Semitism and hate that I'm finding it more and more difficult. But then I look again at all of the works that I've made in over 40, and I've seen them go out to exhibitions around the world, and people have really appreciated them. And so that gives a little bit of solace for what is going on. But I will not stop. I feel a real need to continue documenting this current situation, because it goes into history and it's there for people to see. I mean, as I said before, I've looked at my work that I've done over the last 5 years, and I can see rather scarily that what I was doing then is happening still, and is actually we're in a much more difficult situation today.
And that is an important role of artists, or can be, to convey that. Mirka, did you have any additional comment?
I can say that going to places in Poland was, there were many tear-filled moments, you know, imagining what happened to my father's family in particular. But I had a really interesting experience in the forest. It's quite beautiful and peaceful there and quiet. I just heard bird song and kept hearing a cuckoo. And I thought, how can this place be somewhere where people walk, ride their bikes through, take their dogs for a walk, and yet it's the site of so many people being murdered. So I just deal with those moments. And like Robin, it makes me feel good to do the work. Like all the diaspora work is also makes me feel good because it connects me to people around the world. This is not just about Jewish diaspora, it's about Indian diaspora, it's about every kind of diaspora you can think of, because this is what happens around the world. So in that regard, it feels better. The other thing is, you know, when something bothers you, just keeping it inside doesn't help, but expressing in some way, whether you're a writer or a composer or a fiber artist, there's something about that, as Robin said, that has a healing effect.
Yeah. I don't want to get into questions about techniques and so forth. It seems like this is a much more important discussion. So we're going to really, I think, do one more quick question here. When memorializing people outside of your families, do you fear or worry about the impact of family members or loved ones who might see the works and be unaware of the work prior to entering a space? How do you honor the people you do not know? Has that ever come up for you?
I made a piece in a couple of years ago called Fragments, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it went out for an exhibit. And I was actually contacted by a woman who was actually working in the gallery by some coincidence, and her family was on this artwork, and it was actually her mother's family. So it was very, very close, very raw. And they were really happy that I was actually memorializing their family so they're not forgotten. And she gave me so much more information. So it gives people the opportunity to talk, to speak about it. And to me, that's a real honor. And whenever I make an artwork, it is about respect. I am very considerate of the people whose work I am stitching, who I've researched. It is all done with the greatest respect and honor for those people. So I would hope that people would appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's similar for me. I have exhibited my work many times, and people will come up to me and they'll say, something like, my entire family were killed in Odessa, or I came to the United States after my grandparents, the stories just come flowing out of people for whom these places or these events are known to them, and they don't talk about it very often. The Holocaust is a taboo subject for many people from in their Jewish childhoods all the way up to now. Talking about the Holocaust now can be a bit even fraught, but people are really wanting to talk about their family experiences. And as Caren said, it gives people an opportunity, and to somebody who they feel they know will really understand. And my work is displayed in a commercial gallery. And the directors tell me that people spend an inordinate amount of time in front of the work and talk to them about things that they feel they have in common with the work. So I think it's a positive.
Yeah. And I want to say, this is an interesting idea, that this idea of tying a piece to the stories that come with it seems to be a great vehicle for future projects for artists. Mirka, did you have anything you wanted to say? We're going to have to close here in a second, but.
No, because my work is so abstract that there's no one who could recognize. There are no names or anything in them. There will be in my own memorial project, for my father's family, but otherwise anyone can relate to what I've done. In fact, when you think about it, no one in this country does not have an immigrant history. It's just about a matter of when. When did someone in their family come?
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you presenters, and also thank all of the participants for joining us today, and those who will join us in the future in recordings on the YouTube playlist that we have. This will also be on SDA's website. I thank you to the sponsors, and if you value the programming you are viewing, please consider making a donation to support this free programming available to all. Next Wednesday, Textile Talks hosts Jorgen, the Enduring Turkish Quilt with Christine Martin, sponsored by the International Quilt Museum. I also want to put in a short plug that on SDA's website, we have an events page, and you can learn more about the journal and different topics. And we have a holding space event that we do every year, this time about makers within and beyond confinement, October 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it is open to the public and will be recorded and put on our website as well. At this time, I want to thank SACWA for sponsoring us and SDA, and wish all of you a good week. Take a moment to just exhale and enjoy outside right now. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much.